Hi, everyone, and welcome to this month's pop-up webinar. I'm Melissa Murphy, General Counsel here at the Fund, and I have the great pleasure of hosting these pop-up webinars from time to time. And we listen to you on this particular topic and have created an expanded special edition of the pop-up webinar. This one's an hour long, plus it has materials, it has a PowerPoint and some other handouts for you that we do not normally do during these pop-up webinars. I'm joined today by Deputy General Counsel Shannon Widman. She's going to be doing most of the heavy lifting today. So welcome, Shannon.
Hi, Melissa.
And we are recording this webinar, so it will be available to you soon on a new resource page that we're going to be talking about today. And so let's talk about what we're talking about today. We're going to talk about the new broker compensation rules, what we believe you need to know. So what's our agenda for today? Shannon, let's show the agenda. She's in charge of the PowerPoint. We are going to do a recap of the new broker compensation rules at a very high level, talk about what restrictions have been put on MLS, what is the new deal with buyer broker compensation, and then we're going to dive into some real details by utilizing the new forms that have been promulgated by Florida Realtors. There are 2 new riders to the FAR bar contract, and Florida Realtors also has some new compensation agreements that we want to make you aware of. We are then going to talk about what your role can be in this new world and how you interact with brokers and licensees. And then Shannon's going to talk about all of the new resources that we have developed for you on this topic. A couple of housekeeping items. There is a link in the handout section of your screen that have the full Florida Realtor forms. We're copying excerpts in the PowerPoint slide, but the full forms are available to you over there, along with the presentation today, so that if for some reason you wanted to download this PowerPoint deck, you could do so. We have the wonderfully talented Renee Rattan in the background who will be monitoring your questions. So we encourage you to post your questions in the chat, and we will try to answer as many of those questions as we can, time permitting, and I guess within our skill and knowledge level, Shannon, we will try to answer the questions. But if we don't get to your question, we are tracking those questions and we will respond individually to you at some point soon after the webinar today. So next slide doesn't say much. It just introduces the fact that we have new rules. This is all based on a settlement that the National Association of Realtors entered into with a series of plaintiffs and some class action lawsuits. And this settlement has introduced a whole bunch of new forms and procedures that truly change the way you and other real estate professionals do business. And to me, the biggest change is that buyers must have a written agreement with a broker before that broker can offer services, before they can work with a buyer. And that includes showings of the house. And then there are other forms that have been created or revised that incorporate various terms of these settlements. Listing agreement has been altered. The FAR bar contract has been offered with these 2 riders that I already mentioned, and 2 new compensation agreements that accompany the contract riders. So, does this sound confusing to you? Well, you're not alone, I promise you. Fund members spoke to us and we listened. And so today we're taking this deeper dive into the new practice changes. And as I already mentioned, introducing you to a whole new group of member tools that we have developed so that you can become the expert on this subject and share that knowledge with your real estate referral partners and with your clients. So, what are the main rules that we need to know about now that this settlement has been approved? So, Shannon, take it away.
Yeah, rule number 1, no offers of broker compensation can be made on or through the MLS, not even the sneaky kind. We've probably heard before some sneaky brokers or agents might try to take a picture of 3 bananas on the kitchen countertop and then throw that picture into the MLS. Well, they can't even do that. So today we're going to talk about the other ways that brokers may advertise offers of compensation within the rules. Number 2, main takeaway is brokers and consumers must enter into some form of written agreement with certain disclosures and compensation requirements prior to that buyer working with the agent. That means even before they can go and see the property before a showing. So this part of the rule takes some getting used to and can get a little complicated. So there's different types of buyer brokerage agreements. We can dive in a little bit further. We have provided you with copies of these agreements in the handout section. And Melissa, where did you say those are? You can go
they
to the
are
top.
Over in the handout section, which is the right-hand panel of what you're viewing in your screen. They're PDFs. All you need to do is just click on them and download them.
Okay, great. So I guess the first one we have here is the buyer broker agreement. And if you go to that agreement, you'll see paragraph 7 specifies how much the buyer agrees to pay the broker for his or her services. And this amount must be objectively ascertainable and may not be a range. Paragraph 14 contains the required disclosures, including an important provision that states the broker may not receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to with the consumer. This is an important section. This is the first document a buyer signs in the transaction, but unless it's otherwise modified in writing between the parties, it will trump all other subsequent documents the buyer enters into. So that's really counterintuitive to our normal contract practice. Attorneys and brokers aren't used to that. In traditional practice, the latest document that we enter into changing a prior term would prevail. Well, that's not the case here. The parties have an opportunity to go back and they can modify their agreement, but absent any written modification, this is the maximum amount of compensation any broker may receive. Paragraphs 2 and 3 of the buyer brokerage agreement seem self-explanatory regarding the terms and the term of the agreement and the location of the property, but these sections are important nonetheless. You want to make sure that your buyer hasn't entered into 2 agreements at the same time during the same term. And similarly, you want to make sure that this buyer has not entered into another agreement for the same property location. They may think they've got it covered. One broker is bringing them through one neighborhood and one another, but we've heard of conflicts here where a buyer has entered into 2 separate agreements just wanting to see 2 different properties from 2 different listing agents, and they didn't realize they were obligated to both because that listing agent also had them sign this buyer brokerage agreement. Paragraph 6 is kind of interesting. It provides that the buyer must pay a non-refundable retainer to the broker for its services. We are interested to hear about how fund members may encounter this paragraph in particular. We haven't heard a lot about it. We haven't heard it really being used by brokers. So please reach out to us and let us know if you're using this provision or if you're advising your brokers or buyers for that matter to enter into this retainer agreement provision.
So before we move beyond this, Shannon, I just want to maybe clarify and ask some questions. So if you're representing a buyer or reviewing this agreement on behalf of a buyer, I guess that's the same thing, you want to pay close attention to the length of time that this agreement binds the buyer, because it would depend on what that buyer's particular circumstances are. Similarly, if the buyer is under the impression that this agreement doesn't really obligate them to do much, and they are thinking that they will enter into an agreement with Realtor A to show them properties in neighborhood A, and then Realtor B to show them properties in neighborhood B, then paragraph 3 becomes really critical in how the type of property and location of that property is described. So am I reading this correctly?
That's exactly right. That's exactly kind of the scenario that we have heard that has become problematic. Thankfully, in the stories that I've heard so far, the brokers kind of work together and maybe pay the other one a referral to just kind of settle their differences and make this issue go away. It's new for everybody, so everyone's just trying to get used to it. But when advising either your buyer or your broker referral sources, you want to pay close attention to those sections. Don't just overlook them because they're easy blanks to fill in.
Yeah. And paragraph 6 is optional. There's nothing in the settlement that requires a retainer. That's just something that the Florida realtors, because they represent the realtors in this situation, that they included in their contract, but it's not an obligatory provision, right?
That's correct. It's not obligatory. We're hearing rumblings that this was put in this agreement now, so it can apply more maybe toward commercial later. But right now, these rules don't apply to commercial. So it's interesting that it's in here, and maybe that's why we haven't heard a lot about how it's used in practice. But it'll be interesting to see whether this provision is used and how.
All right, so the next area we're going to talk about is sort of how you work with a buyer. And one of the question that immediately came to my mind when I read about this settlement and the prohibition of anything in the multiple listing service about sharing of commissions or payment of commissions, compensation, sorry, the term is compensation now. So how does the buyer broker that's working with a buyer, how do they find out what the seller is willing to do, if anything, toward paying their compensation?
Well, more communication is required. So at first, I think when these rules first were implemented and practice changes were implemented in August, I think a lot of listing agents they didn't want to talk. A lot of agents and brokers just didn't want to communicate with each other. Maybe they were just too afraid of breaking the rules right out of the gate. But what we're finding now is that they're learning how to communicate more effectively. You know, phone tag can be annoying. So, the agents are faced with fraud every day. So agents are on high alert not to answer texts from unknown contacts. They don't want to click on anything. They have cybersecurity issues just like real estate attorneys do. And emails are just too slow sometimes for the real estate market. Things move quickly. Agents aren't at their desk all day. So there's creative solutions the listing agents are using to better communicate offers. of compensation and to help alleviate the delays from inconvenient communication. So some things that some of them are doing are maybe putting a dedicated page on their website that does not link to the MLS that basically says, here are all my listings and this is the offers of compensation for each. But absent that, the best thing an agent can do, a buyer's agent can do when they just don't know, is just make an offer. Make an offer with the terms that your buyer wants. And as we go through the forms today, we'll help you determine how to structure offers using the new forms, depending on whether the buyer would like a seller concession toward the buyer's broker compensation, if that seller is willing to pay the buyer's broker directly or indirectly through the listing agent, or if they're just not willing to do so and the buyer has to pay their own broker compensation.
So let's talk briefly about the bullet point that says flyers on site. Is that a permissible way for listing agents to let a buyer broker know what the seller is willing to do?
It sure is. It sure is. They can have flyers on site at the house. So when they're touring, they know then. And like the other ones, social media is a big one. We are seeing agents share on their social media pages what their offers of compensation are to the buyer's broker. But again, you have to make sure that this information isn't coming through the MLS and being shared. It's a separate share onto social media. And then, but seller's concession though, that could be different. Melissa, we had talked about that before. Some MLS groups, they allow you to advertise that you're offering a seller concession to buyer broker compensation on the MLS.
And other MLSs do not allow that.
That's right. It's up to the local board to make those rules. So you have to know what your local MLS board will support.
So sort of the fallback position for a buyer broker, if they can't get any information, is just to go ahead and make an offer with that incorporates what the buyer would like for the seller to do. But before we get to that, let's look at the listing agreement, which is, of course, where the listing broker would talk with the seller about what they are willing to do. So let's look at what changes Florida Realtor has made to the standard listing agreement and talk in terms of working with the seller.
Yeah, so when you work with the seller, you have to show what is the seller willing to do. There are different options. The seller can agree to pay the listing broker a certain percentage. That's in paragraph 8, which we'll look at, and then authorize that listing broker to share that portion of that percentage with the buyer's broker. The seller may agree to pay the buyer's broker directly on the settlement statement, that not being that much different than what we've just discussed through the broker, because we're talking about an escrow format. Or the seller could say, I'm not doing it. I'm not paying buyer broker compensation. They're on their own. These are the new rules. This is my price to take that into account. There are seller concessions that we're going to talk about that are in the listing agreement. And then, of course, after you enter into a listing agreement, once an offer comes, you might want to make changes to that. So there's modification options for that.
All right, well, let's look at some specific provisions in the listing agreement. And let me remind all of our viewers that the full listing agreement form as modified is part of the handout that we've made available to you. So you can get a copy of the full agreement, but we're just going to hit the paragraphs that are pertinent to the new rules.
That's right. And so paragraph 8, really this one isn't much different than what we had seen prior to the NAR settlement. It explains the seller's obligation to compensate the listing broker and in what amount.
That looks pretty familiar.
Pretty familiar, pretty straightforward.
Pretty familiar.
So then we get to paragraph 9, and paragraph 9 basically puts the seller on notice that, hey, once in a while, buyers may make an offer that really propose that you pay part of the buyer's broker compensation. These are new rules and new times. And they also refer to another agreement that would be required, another written agreement that would be required if that's the case. And then you go to paragraph 10, and that sort of contemplates that option. So 10A anticipates that the seller's broker is going to share part of its compensation with the buyer's broker, kind of the old school arrangement. Then paragraph 10B is that the seller pays the buyer's broker compensation directly at closing. And the difference between A and B is that A takes into account that this is a shared compensation of the amount referred to in paragraph 8 of the total. 10B is a separate percentage that the seller is paying the buyer's broker directly.
So some examples, go back to the previous slide. So some examples here. So if under paragraph 8, I agree, I'm the seller, and I agree to pay my broker 6%.
Right.
I'm picking that arbitrary number, but it'll sound familiar to everybody. I agree to pay them 6%. And then under paragraph 10, I would probably, under 10A, authorize them to share that compensation with a buyer broker, and I would specify the amount that I am authorizing them to share with the buyer broker. Am I getting that right so far?
That's right. Out of that 6%, this is what you would authorize them to share.
Authorize them to pay. And then if under paragraph 8, I said, I'll pay you 2%.
Mm-hmm.
Then under paragraph 10, 10B, I might say, I am authorizing you to let a buyer broker know that I'm willing to pay them an additional 1% or 2%. So if that is the case and that all works out, then I would pay 2% to my listing agent and the 1 or 2% that I had agreed to pay to the buyer broker.
That's correct.
Okay. All right, let's go on to seller concessions because that can get a little dicey, I think.
Yeah, so paragraph 3C of the listing agreement talks about the willingness of the seller to pay a concession to the buyer as a percentage of the purchase price or an amount not to exceed, X amount. You can really fill in the blank here, but what's important to know about this option is that this covers all expenses. This could cover loan fees, it could cover other closing costs. This is everything, not just buyer broker compensation. So 3C is really all encompassing. It's I am willing to pay up to this amount for any of the buyer's closing costs.
So this amount of money could include what the buyer has agreed to pay their broker or a portion of what they have agreed to pay their broker. The buyer can basically use this concession however they want to, subject to probably their lender's approval. Okay.
Yes.
And then you mentioned earlier that some MLS services may not allow this to be advertised. And so you do have to pay attention to what the local MLS might prohibit.
That's right.
Okay. All right, so we've talked about buyer broker agreements. We've talked about changes to the listing agreement, let's turn to the offer itself, and we are going to be utilizing the FAR contract as a basis for our discussion, and we're going to talk about some riders, new riders that, excuse me, have been developed to facilitate these new practice changes. And there are two new riders called FF and GG. And it took me a while to figure out why they're called FF and GG, because I was trying to attribute some significance to the labeling for the topic of these riders, but it's just that those were the next two available numbers or letters on the list of many, many, many riders that Florida Bar has. So don't get distracted as I did by FF and GG. So let's talk about how these riders can be used, Shannon.
Yeah, so these are really your options for your buyer, for working with your buyer. And especially if you don't have any information about what the seller might be willing to do. So when you want to include rider FF or GG, you use it in the other provisions paragraph of the FAR contract. It's paragraph 19. And you actually write it in right now until they make the next change to the FAR contract. Well, they'll actually have it in there with a checkbox where you just have to add it by checkbox. Sometimes it's just the buyer's best option to go ahead and make the offer. It depends on which kind of structure the buyer wants to, what kind of offer the buyer wants to make for you to determine whether you go with FF or GG. FF, we can look at that first. This is your credit. This is your buyer's credit from the seller, or seller concession, we've called it. Now, we just talked about how paragraph 3C of the listing agreement is this any concession from the seller. Well, that's different than what is here in FF. FF is particular to the buyer's broker compensation. This is what the seller is willing to pay just toward buyer's broker compensation. So you can see how here you would put the percentage of the purchase price or the amount, but keep in mind that this amount still may not exceed the amount that is in the buyer brokerage agreement that we talked about at the outset between the buyer and the buyer's broker.
So if under the buyer broker agreement, the buyer has agreed to pay 1% to their broker for working with them, and then this offer is made and 2% of the purchase price is inserted into box number 1 here, where you are asking the seller, give me a credit of 2% of the purchase price that I will use to pay my broker. That's not in compliance with the rules, because the buyer broker agreement says 1%. That's the maximum that the buyer broker can get. And here you're making an offer where you're asking the seller to pay 2%. So that's a problem, right?
Yes, it's a problem. It needs to match. It at least needs to not exceed what's in the buyer broker agreement. There is language at the bottom here that says, in the event the credit described above exceeds the amount allowed by buyer's lender for such contributions, and that takes into account the fact that a buyer's lender may not like the idea that there's a credit being given to the buyer for such things. So it tells you what you can do with the balance, but it also says in the event the credit described above exceeds the limit allowed by the buyer broker agreement, then the credit will be adjusted to the amount allowed under the buyer broker agreement as may be amended. So best practice is to amend your buyer broker agreement so you're not out of the maximum that is stated in that agreement.
So a number of people would be very interested in making sure that the credit that is given is the correct amount. Closing agents, buyer broker. Oh, yes. So it's getting complicated. All right, that's rider FF. What about GG?
So GG is if the buyer wants to structure the offer so that, or the listing agent pay the buyer's broker. So this is the contract addendum that needs to be included if the buyer wants to structure the offer that way. If you check the first box, the seller's broker shares the commission, or the compensation rather, with the buyer's broker. The second box you'll see is where the seller and the buyer's broker execute a separate agreement, so the seller pays the buyer's broker compensation directly. So what this rider says is that basically you have 3 days to have these other parties enter into another agreement regarding buyer broker compensation. Depending on which box you choose, you have to pick the correct compensation agreement. So yet another form to look at.
So is there a big difference between these two options on how compensation is shown on the closing statement?
There's not. There shouldn't be. Is paying the buyer's broker compensation, it's showing as a debit on the seller side, and then it's showing a payment to the correct broker. But in practice, that it could be different. Some listing brokers prefer that the seller pay the buyer's broker compensation directly. I've heard from different brokers that they just don't want to be caught up in another agreement where the seller's broker is then obligated to the buyer's broker under a separate compensation agreement. They'd rather just have the seller execute that agreement with a buyer's broker and stay out of it.
So this rider creates a contingency that will require that an additional agreement be entered into within a period of time. If it's left blank, it's 3 days. And if that doesn't happen, then the buyer has the right to cancel the contract?
That's right. It's a contingency, and the buyer's making this offer at a certain price with the idea that they're not going to have to come out of pocket to pay their buyer broker compensation that they agreed to in their buyer brokerage agreement. This amount from the seller would offset that, so it could be a significant amount. They're not willing to make the offer without this contract rider, so it has to be a contingency to the contract.
So these riders, or this rider, GG, refers to these other compensation agreements. So let's look at those other compensation agreements.
So first up, we'll talk about the compensation agreement CASB. This is where the seller pays the compensation to the buyer's broker directly. This is an agreement between the seller and the buyer's broker. So you think about the privity of contract. The contract itself is between the seller and the buyer. They enter into a rider, GG. Seller and buyer are parties to that rider. That rider brings in a third party, the buyer's broker. So this is the seller's obligation to compensate the buyer's broker in this amount. And again, this amount may not exceed the amount that's stated in the buyer brokerage agreement.
And this is just paragraph 4. out of this compensation agreement, and I'm reminding everybody that you have a copy of the full compensation agreement, between seller and buyer broker. You have a full copy in the handout. All right, so the other form is where the brokers are going to work directly with each other. So what's in this one?
That's right. This is CABB. So think about BB at the end, meaning broker and broker, two brokers. That's a good way to remember. This is where the compensation is shared between the seller's broker and the buyer's broker. So that's what this agreement is. It's included as a compensation agreement that's entered into pursuant to a rider to the contract between the buyer and the seller, but it obligates and is between the seller's broker and the buyer's broker. So they now have a separate agreement saying, okay, we will share this amount with you at closing.
And again, the amount that the seller's broker is agreeing to pay the buyer broker cannot exceed what is in the original buyer broker agreement between the buyer and the buyer's broker. So people can't forget that this does not trump the buyer broker agreement that was entered into earlier in time.
That's right. Now, we're not saying that can't be modified. If the terms of the agreement work out, the buyer and the seller get together and say, okay, this is the agreement we want to structure and this is what we're signing off on, then they can work with the brokers, with the agents to decide, okay, we'll pay you this amount. Let's modify our buyer brokerage agreement so that amount can be paid to you. So it's easily modified. It just has to be done in writing. Can't forget about that.
Right. All right, so let's try to talk about these things and try to pull these various provisions together. So start us off here.
Yeah, so we talked about how the listing agreement, paragraph 3C, talks about the seller's willingness to pay a concession toward buyer's closing costs. That would be where we would bring in rider FF to the contract. But remember that rider FF to the contract is just with regard to broker compensation. So the costs that are referred to in the listing agreement, paragraph 3C, may exceed the amount that's in rider FF or be equal to it. It's just the amount the seller is willing to pay toward that. The listing agreement, paragraph 8, what happens when that exceeds the buyer brokerage agreement? We talked about that a little bit. The listing agreement says paragraph 8 says I'm willing to pay, X amount total for broker compensation, and then 10A says basically that compensation will be shared. Well, the buyer brokerage agreement, whatever that share amount is, we cannot exceed what's in that buyer brokerage agreement. And we can talk to members as well about, what does this look like to you? How are you getting all this information to know whether or not this amount exceeds what's in the buyer brokerage agreement? I think that's what a lot of members are facing right now, and something they're asking for more information. Some brokers are willing to give them these forms and say, here's my buyer brokerage agreement. This is the amount, I'm supposed to be paid. I'm not supposed to be paid more than that. And then some brokers we're hearing are just not willing to turn that information over. So, is there an ethical obligation there we're talking about? It seems like it.
I agree. That is definitely a confusing part of how this is all going to be implemented in the real world. And just a quick shout out to everybody listening. We would love to hear about your experiences with this and how you are working that out with your referral partners. So please share that information with Shannon. When there's a new mortgage loan, what types of considerations do you need to think about when you're preparing the closing statement and getting loan approval?
Yeah, I mean, this is new for lenders as well. So it used to be they'd have a certain amount of fees that they would let you roll up, closing costs that they would allow a buyer or borrower to roll up into their loan. This is not one of them. Buyer brokerage compensation, they don't want that rolled up into a loan amount. It's good to have real good communication from the outset with your lender and find out what kind of loan it is that the buyer is getting, what expenses can be paid and what can't. Make sure that if it is an allowable expense, that it doesn't exceed the amount that's allowed to be paid to what they call interested parties. Or if it's a seller concession, will they even allow the seller concession? I mean, I think we've dealt with that one before, as members have seen seller concessions for a long time. So this is kind of the same conversation that you're having with the lender. It's just not always a concession anymore. Sometimes it's just an extra fee if the buyer has to pay it.
So I find it interesting to think about how a fund member plays a role in their practices when they are advising the broker or the licensee or the agent. What types of issues would you remind them of?
Well, I think in general, what we've seen so far is that a lot of brokers are still unsure how to use all of these forms and what they do and how they interact. What we tend to see right now is a lot of brokers just drawing up all the language themselves and sticking that into the additional terms. And maybe that will get them through the transaction and maybe it won't. But these, the FAR Bar Committee worked hard on these forms. They all work together. There's a reason for each one of the forms to have the verbiage that it has in there. So as a fund member, you can really use the resources that we put on the website on thefund.com. There's a great one-pager on there. It tells you, if I want the buyer to have the structure and offer, so the seller pays the buyer's broker compensation directly, what are the forms I need to use? And there's a quick one-pager checklist that tells you which forms you need to use, so you can help advise your broker through that process so they can structure the offer using the right forms. Some of these agents are saying, or some of these buyers are saying, I don't want to sign all these forms. I've closed 20 properties in the last 5 years. I've never had to do this before. Well, yeah, that's right. It's new for everybody. This isn't, they have had to have heard about, if they're sophisticated at all and have closed 20 properties, they've probably heard that there's a new thing out there called this NAR settlement and heard some rumblings about it. So it's a matter of educating and sharing the information that you have as a fund member, articulating your value proposition to those brokers so they can articulate their value proposition to their buyers and sellers.
Agreed. It's a whole new world. The other area that I find interesting and love to get feedback from members is, how does the closing agent deal with this? And you've alluded to that a little bit, but everybody is feeling their way. And the main goal of a closing agent is to prepare an accurate closing statement, whether it's a CD or a settlement statement. They want it to be correct. They don't want to deal with issues after the closing or issues at the closing table, which is a really awkward way or time for problems to come up. but everybody is trying to figure out what makes them comfortable. And so are you going to ask the buyer to provide you with a copy of the buyer broker agreement? Are you going to ask the buyer broker to send that to you? I've heard a lot of feedback that listing agents are not going to share their listing agreement with a closing agent. And some closing agents feel like they need that information. I've also talked with fund members across the state, and here's what they tell me. Look, for the brokers that we have worked with for 10, 15, 20 years, and they're really good at their job and I trust them, I'll take an email from them telling me what the deal is, what the compensation arrangement is. I will accept an email. But if it's somebody I don't know, or it's somebody that has not a sterling reputation in the community, I might want something more. The other factor is that it is the broker that is compensated, not the licensee. And so some closing agents are saying, I'll take an email, but it has to be from the broker, not the listing agent, not the buyer's agent. It has to come from the broker. So I think everyone is going to have to figure out what makes them most comfortable, what is the best thing that they can rely on. I've also talked with brokers and said, basically, give the closing agents a break here because not everybody's going to do it the same way. Some people are going to require something from you. Some are going to be comfortable with something from your agents, from your licensees. An email might be fine, but somebody might want something signed by you. So be patient until we all kind of figure this out, because everybody wants the closing statement to be correct. Everybody wants the compensation that is paid correct and not in violation of the settlement. And so there are just a lot of things that we're going to have to figure out as we go along. So I mentioned when I welcomed everybody to this webinar that the fund wants you to have as many resources as we can think of to make sure that fund members are educated about these new rules and that you can build confidence in advising your clients that might be buyers and sellers, or your partners, your referral partners, your broker friends, when you all are talking about these changes. So Shannon, tell us about the resources that we've developed here at the fund.
Yes, so I spoke briefly about the kind of a one-pager quick reference guide that we formulated. So depending on what kind of offer your buyer wants to make, we give you a simple checklist for the 4 different types. There's seller paying buyer's broker directly. There's seller paying the buyer's broker indirectly through the listing agent. There is the seller offering a concession to the buyer, and then there's the buyer paying its own compensation to the buyer's broker. So those 4 scenarios for broker compensation are all broken down into a quick reference guide telling you which forms to use.
Go to the next slide, because I think we have a list generally right. Describes. That's okay.
Helpful, right?
Yeah.
Then we have presentations for fund members. Basically, we have taken each scenario, each of those 4 scenarios I just discussed, and we have made PowerPoint presentations for you to share with your broker referrals. There are also videos, kind of a how to use those 4 different scenarios. So you can get in front of your favorite brokerage and basically show them how to use these forms in these new scenarios. So there's a how-to as well as the PowerPoint slides themselves that you can co-brand and use to get in front of your referral sources. And then finally, we have links to all of the forms and also to the FAQs that are on the Florida Realtors website, which is so super helpful.
And the reason why we develop these resources is that this is such a great opportunity for fund members to become known as the expert on these new rules and make it very clear to the brokers and agents in their area that they are experts. You can come to me. I know how to guide you through these different forms and through the different rules. This is such a great opportunity for you to show your value to your referral partners out there and get new business, solidify the existing relationships that you have, but also establish new ones. And it's also a great value to your buyer and seller clients when you know exactly what they are asking you about when they call you and say, hey, this broker sent me this form that they want me to sign, and I've never had to do that before. Will you take a look at it? You will know what they're talking about. And so we develop these PowerPoints that you can co-brand and take out to your referral partners. So please take advantage of these resources. Do yourselves a favor and establish a reputation as an expert on these new rules. We've provided you with all of the tools to do that. I do see a question on the chat that was answered already. Is that maybe that's the only question that we got, Shannon? So we must have answered all the questions that everybody had. If that's not the case and you did post a question, we will get a copy of that question after the fact and we will answer it for you after the fact. So thank you very much for tuning in today. We hope that you appreciate the additional information and additional detail that we have provided. Shannon is in charge of this project for us here at the fund, so there is her contact information that you can send questions and comments and feedback. Please provide us with the feedback and go on this page of our website that has all of these resources and give us feedback on those too. So with that, I will wrap it up and say thanks again, but above all, thank you for your support of the fund.